Сэлгэр уужим орон зай. Хараа баясгах, үзмжид харуулцтай. Хансаг давтагдшгүй өнгө төрх, таныг илэрхийлэх төгс хийцлэл. Тав тухтай амьдрах орчин. Орчин дизайны үүрэг шийдэл. Байгаль орчин дээлтэй ногоон барилга концепц. Таны гэр бүлд тав тухыг билүүлэн аз жаргалтай амьдралыг бадраах үеэс үед өвлөгдөх үнэтэй. Тав тухын элчин захиалганда урж байна.
King Tower Apartment.
Өнөөдөр манай Defacto нэвтрүүлгийн зочноор Америкийн нэгдсэн улсын, Олон улсын, Бүгд Найрамдахчуудын институт түүний захирал ноён Даниел Твайнинг оролцож байна.
Даниел Твайнинг Бүгд Найрамдахчуудын Олон улсын Хүрээлэнгийн ерөнхийлөгч. Оксфордын их сургуульд Fulbright Оксфордын хамтарсан тэтгэлгээр 2004-өөс 2007 онд суралцж төгсжээ. Герман Маршал сангийн Азийн хөтөлбөрийн ерөнхийлөгч, захирлын зөвлөх, Америкийн нэгдсэн улсын төрийн нарийн бичгийн даргын бодлого төлөвлөлтийн багийн гишүүн, Сенатч Джон Маккейн агсны гадаад бодлогын зөвлөх, Америкийн нэгдсэн улсын худалдааны төлөөлөгчийн газарт албан хаагчаар тус ажиллаж байжээ. Мөн Америкийн нэгдсэн улсын үндэсний тагнуулын зөвлөлд ажилтан, Georgetown их сургуульд профессор, Тэнгисийн цэргийн агсан түвшний сургуульд цэргийн сургагч багшаар ажиллаж байв. Өдгөө Буш институтын дэргэдэх хүн төрөлхтний эрх чөлөөний зөвлөл болон Вилсон төвийн Аз бүс нутгийн зөвлөлийн гишүүний үүргийг гүйцэтгэдэг.
So good evening.
It's great to be with you. Thank you.
Congratulations with 30 years of working, doing the great job in Mongolia.
We're proud to walk with Mongolians on their democratic journey. It's been quite an amazing 3 decades.
Let's talk first a bit about your organization, which has, I understand, 800 or so staff all around the world. In how many countries, and when it was founded, and who is financing this institute?
Thanks. So the International Republican Institute is part of the National Endowment for Democracy. It was created in 1983 to support democracy and freedom in the world. It's quite interesting when you think about the world in 1983. Mongolia was a captive nation. The Soviet Empire still looked very strong. Many countries were ruled by dictators, military generals, autocrats. Democracy was not looking positive and optimistic in 1983.
Almost more countries, twice more countries were, I think, compared with today.
Absolutely, including almost every country in Asia. But President Reagan had a vision of a world that was free and open and pluralistic, and he argued that cultural imperialism was believing that only Westerners could enjoy democracy and freedom, and that what the Soviet Empire and various dictators around the world were most afraid of were their own citizens and this aspiration for democratic dignity. So we now work, we have teams on the ground in about 80 countries, and we partner with civil society groups, with political parties, with women and young people who want to get more involved in politics to help them find their voice and help build strong, resilient, democratic societies. And part of the reason for that, of course, is that we know that this is how we fulfill humans' fundamental aspirations. People want to be free, but it's also a very pragmatic way for countries to be more prosperous, more secure, more just.
And we need really that, what you said, the voice of people in running the country, which is a part of democracy. Let's see, now very interesting because I know your institute from the beginning, and for the last 30 years you have been helping a lot in intellectual empowerment of the country and increasing the voice of democracy, I think, among all people. So let's look at what we have done for the last 30 years from today. What happening was still the government is not completely doing what we wanted. Free market, which is the basis of the democracy, freedom of speech, is kind of limited with more participation of the state. And it's not this situation not only in Mongolia, in many countries. So what is the best to improve the situation, you think?
So every country is different. Every democracy is different. Every country has its own culture and traditions. So what we know at IRI is from working in about 120, 130 countries all over the world. Every degree of democratic development, every culture, every region, we know a couple things that do work. strong and effective political parties, obviously free and competitive elections so that people have a real choice and a voice, and their political voice is echoed through parties. Very strong and robust civil society. Really, what makes democracy work is not the government. What makes democracy succeed is a very active and engaged population engaging in civic life, right? If everybody only votes and doesn't do anything else, that's not democracy.
That's in a way what's happening here. People just come to election and they think it's the democracy. But it's a half of democracy, as you said. About this robust civic society, why that robust civil society is a part of really prosperity?
I mean, really what civil society does is balance government power. And it also channels citizen expression. So instead of just my individual voice, I can join a civic group, a neighborhood association, or a club, or an NGO with other people who care about what I care about. It could be clean environment. It could be safety and security. It could be education. Whatever the issue is, these are how you channel citizen demands to government. And if you only have citizens and government, what you need in between is civil society and political parties. That's what makes democracy work.
Civil society and political parties together.
You need
balancing each other.
Yes.
Now we come to because Mongolian people were divided at certain time, still now by two political parties completely. And if the one party, Democratic Party, wins, many people lose jobs, government jobs in particular. If People's Party comes, then Democratic Party people slowly lose everything. So it is more dividing the nations, even a family inside. So what is that trigger that moves the people towards civil society? How does it work?
So I think the trigger is realizing that we all have a role to play in our public life, in our political life. Most of us cannot be politicians. Most of us cannot be senior government officials. But every one of us has a voice. But we have to organize so that government hears us. And we need to make sure that the issues that we care about as citizens are on the government's agenda. We need strong and effective multi-party politics because, of course, one party, you have a one-party system without competition. That's what China has or North Korea. So parties compete with each other over the best ideas, who can best represent citizen concerns and who can best take the country forward. And the answer is in the United States, sometimes it'll be one party, sometimes it'll be another. But it's very fundamental to democracy to have an actively healthy multi-party system.
Exactly. In that context, how do you find your work in Mongolia currently?
So our work in Mongolia has progressed for 30 years now. We've been here working with Mongolians. The first effort was around helping to create a strong multi-party political system, real political parties that offered citizens a choice. The second phase was helping support strengthening parliament so that parliament could function, so that it wasn't just a powerful executive, but strong legislature representing citizen concerns. And the third phase is empowering civil society, protecting civic space. Because again, if it's only government and political parties and civic space is shrinking, that's a backward step for democracy.
Well, if we touch a bit one by one, I remember early times, really, these new political parties, representatives were visiting your country, your parliament, Capitol Hill, and I think that was also a good part of the multi-party system, foundations in Mongolia. About parliament also, the parliament members since that, every time a group of them visiting. Now about the civil society. What is the challenges you think in civil society development in Mongolia?
So, we have this issue in the United States and many countries where when you're in government, you don't like criticism from civil society. But it's also healthy that if the government controls civic life, it's no longer a democracy. So obviously civic groups need to be responsible and focused in their advocacy. Of course, they need to be peaceful and nonviolent, but they are the most important element in a democracy, strong civil society. And you see, for instance, in China, just to take one example, where all civic life is crushed, repressed. There can be nothing except the party state, nothing underneath, no religion, no neighborhood organizations, etc., etc. This is very dangerous. So, of course, civil society in Mongolia has been traditionally actually quite strong and robust and has been one of the pillars of democracy here. And, of course, Mongolians want that to continue.
Yeah, without a strong civil society, you cannot imagine democracy working.
It doesn't work.
What is the role in that regard of media?
Free and independent media is essential.
Yes.
Media that's not state-owned or censored, that can provide objective news and facts and truth to citizens. Of course, in any media ecosystem, there will be different news outlets. You know, in America, I can wake up and read 5 great newspapers every day, and each one has a different point of view, and that's healthy. So what you want is different points of view. And you want the media landscape to represent all points of view. But fundamentally, you need a free and effective media landscape to help citizens understand what government is doing, and also to fight disinformation and misinformation, both domestically generated and foreign authoritarian misinformation and disinformation.
Exactly. And nowadays, this media platform is a bit changed. More social media platform is more active. In that regard, disinformation, misinformation comes very strongly and people get confused. What is the best way for media to combat that challenge?
I mean, it helps if you can spotlight sources of misinformation. If you know that a foreign government is running a propaganda operation, to spotlight it. It helps to have strong programs like this, where you're discussing very candidly the issues of the day. Mm-hmm. It helps, of course, to have a variety of sources of news so that nobody is reliant on one source. But social media, of course, it cuts both ways. We've seen it in the United States. It can be a great source of information, but it can also amplify extremist voices.
That's unfortunately we have seen all around the world,
yes,
including your country, and Mongolia as well. But I like this point that first reaction, and the first what you said, is to spotlight that source of that information, whatever it is. As soon as you find it a mis or disinformation, then that in that regard, could you bring good example of this kind of action by media?
Sure. I mean, I don't know enough, really, I think, about the Mongolian case, except I do know, for instance, just to take an obvious example in the news, a dictator in Russia invaded a sovereign neighbor who was peaceful, who was not threatening Russia. Ukrainians were just trying to build their democracy and build prosperity. There's a lot of Russian disinformation in Mongolia and around the world. Somehow Ukraine was run by Nazis, which is crazy. Ukraine's a democratic country with an elected civilian president. That somehow Ukraine was threatening Russia. All Ukrainians want to do is get far away from Russia. They don't want to be part of any new Russian empire.
Yet the Russian media said that this during 8 years, they say, since Russia took Crimea, and they said that they were killing our Russians in Ukraine, and somehow they were brutally killing children, etc. This can completely, how to combat this kind of misinformation, which is very deeply sitting in the Russians' mind today, who are majority supporting the war.
So in Russia, if somebody calls you and says, do you support the war? You say yes, because if you say no, you go to prison for 15 years. There's a long prison term if you oppose the war. So those numbers are not real. When you see some of this information, it's not real. I think this emphasizes the importance of free media, which Russia doesn't have. Putin has systematically shut down every free media outlet in Russia over the last decade. And so Russians are captured in a giant state propaganda bubble. So Russians believe a totally different story about the war in Ukraine than the rest of the world believes. The rest of the world is seeing the truth, which is that Russia attacked a peaceful neighbor, really for no good reason, and wants to swallow it. And by the way, that world would be very dangerous for Mongolia if big neighbors could swallow small neighbors, including on the basis of historical ties.
Yes. Well, if you take the historical ties and historical logics they were using, we can claim also over China and Russia in that sense. Anyway, so what to do, for example, what the Russian civic society, which is kind of dispersed somehow, what are they to do with this complete close down every independent media now?
So they're working to get free and independent information into Russia. The most effective operation is run by Alexei Navalny, who is now a political prisoner.
Yeah.
His organization did excellent investigative journalism and spotlighted these grotesque palaces that Vladimir Putin and his henchmen have built. Vladimir Putin's salary is so low. These palaces suggest he's a billionaire, but in fact his salary is about, you can check online, it's about $117,000 a year. He has 3 yachts, he has all these palaces, it's all corrupt money. So the Navalny organization spotlighted this. Nearly every Russian has seen these videos, and they understand the nature of the corrupt system that they live in. So other point on democratic opposition in Russia, Navalny and his organization, they oppose the invasion of Ukraine. In Belarus, which you know Russia has used to attack Ukraine, the democratic opposition in Belarus also opposes the war, which reminds us that if you had democratic governments elected by the people in Russia and Belarus, there would be no war.
Exactly. That's what is happening when you don't have functioning institutes of democracy like parliament, like the parliament now, not a rubber stamp, but they represent in different voices of the whole people, right? In Belarus, the same situation. But however, in the current situation, how do you see what will be the end of the war?
I mean, fundamentally, the way the war ends, one scenario is that Putin falls from power because he's made the biggest strategic mistake in Russia since the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the alliance with the Nazis in the 1930s. And then, of course, Germany invaded Russia and broke that alliance. It was a terrible disaster for Russia. So one way the war ends is Putin falls from power. Another way the war ends is that the free world supports Ukraine, and Ukraine successfully defends itself. Ukraine's not trying to attack Russia, take Russian territory. All Ukraine is trying to do is defend itself, which is why America is supporting Ukraine.
Since Reagan administration, there was a strong belief that once the free market comes to countries like Russia, China, all of the other countries, it will make the prosperity better, and down the road, middle class larger, and they will overthrow all whatever authorities there. Then they will create multi-party system, which is not the case in China and Russia. So, the West, where was their this complete different expectation was from now, right? So, how do you see that multi-party system creation in when and how in Russia, for example?
It's going to take time, but look at Ukraine. Ukraine was part of the Soviet Empire. It had a political system like Russia. Now Ukraine is a strong and successful democracy where people are fighting for their democratic institutions to protect them. One reason Putin attacked Ukraine is because he knows that if Ukraine can build a successful democracy, if Ukrainians can do that, so can Russians. And when Putin says Russians and Ukrainians are one people, actually, Ukraine is a threat to him ideologically because of Ukraine's successful democratic development. What Putin is most afraid of is that Russians will do what Ukrainians did and demand non-corrupt democratic leadership.
Some 240 or so thousand talents left Russia since the war. Some coming to neighbor countries, some few to Mongolia too, and more to Kazakhstan, I know. So altogether, the human resource issue now coming, those who believes, professionally challenging people, right? But when the war ends, somehow, as you said, either overturn him, and how long it will take back to get Russia, as at least before the war, economic situation. What is the general thought on that? Nobody can say exactly, but what is general thought on that?
So, I think they've lost really a generation of development, that Russia's back to, in some ways, where it was in 2000 economically, but in other important ways, it's like the Soviet Union again. That's what Russians say. The international isolation, the effect of the sanctions as a result of the war. And maybe that's what Putin wants. Maybe he wants to be an isolated dictator in a closed system. Because an open system, he cannot sustain himself in power if Russia's open to the world. So he has to create enemies abroad, and then he has to somehow tell a story, which is disinformation about protecting Russia from its enemies.
I was recently in Germany, and there were big discussions going on about discrimination of immigrants. There was one case with Muslims coming to Poland has closed their border and kicked them out back. Now Ukrainians coming, and they're helping all around whole Europe, across Europe. In Germany, you can even drive. You drive Ukraine car, and they are helping them with accommodation, etc. All around, that help is happening. Is there any discrimination towards these two categories of migrants?
So I think they're different, mainly because Ukrainians all want to go home. And actually the flow reversed. Just a couple weeks ago, more Ukrainians went back from Europe into Ukraine than left Ukraine for Europe. So all Ukrainians want to go home. So I think they're temporarily in Europe, but nobody really wants to stay in Europe because they love their country and they want to go back and help rebuild it.
Mongolians who are supporting Russia in a way, they believe that Ukraine really provoked Russia, and Ukraine were provoked by Americans. This kind of rumor is existing. Americans kind of made Ukraine to be member of NATO. Then when the real war starts, they're just escalating the war with weapons. That's the position of some Mongolians.
So Ukraine had no chance of being a NATO member until the war. And now we see how well Ukrainians fight, and some people in America say, well, maybe Ukraine should be a member of NATO. NATO was not going to enlarge at all before the war. Now Finland and Sweden have applied to join NATO. This is a direct result of Putin's aggression. Putin's aggression is what's causing the conversation around NATO expansion.
Even faster.
And why do countries want to be in NATO? Because if you're in NATO, Russia doesn't invade you.
Cannot.
It can't invade you.
Can't.
So all Ukrainians committed no crime. Ukrainians wanted to build a successful democracy and protect their independence. Just like Mongolians for 30 years have built a democracy to protect their independence. That's what Ukraine was doing.
You said independence, to protect independence. We believe that to defend our independence is a very vibrant democracy where people's voice can be heard. If our leaders who are changed by elections, if they do something wrong which harms our independence, people can go out and demonstrate and turn him down. Is it the way democracy works, right?
It is.
It is.
I mean, just like we had President Trump who lost an election because a majority of Americans did not like his policies.
And who was not accepting this loss for several months.
But this is also why you want strong democratic institutions, because democracy is not the gift of one man. It's a product of strong and successful and effective institutions.
Just after the attack on January 6th, the Capitol Hill, I was thinking, well, how fragile is democracy? Even in the America, which was the source of democracy, the idea, whole things is, I thought, so much penetrated into all layers of the society, and suddenly you have a bunch of people coming and attacking the parliament, like in many developing countries. So, how do you see what is the lessons from that whole things in America?
So one lesson is there's no place for political violence in a democracy. In a democracy, you have ample free means to express yourself. Violence can never be one of those means. 2, you want strong democratic institutions.
So it means you even need to make even stronger your democratic institutions now.
And that includes, an independent parliament. That includes independent courts. There have been something like 70 court cases contesting various election cases. The U.S. courts have thrown out every case, saying the election was not stolen. The courts have played a very important role. The media played an important role in covering all the developments and helping Americans understand the truth. But then there's been this problem of disinformation and misinformation as well, is that some of these extremists who attacked the Capitol, they were radicalized by disinformation.
I see the role of media now when they broadcast every details of that hearings, several days, and that hearing itself and the testimony of these people already, I think, make democracy stronger. People to understand what went wrong and why is that so, and but there is no guarantee that this event cannot happen again.
There's no guarantee of anything in life, including that democracy will always succeed and prosper. So every generation has to fight for it and stand up for it, and individual choices matter. I mean, one lesson of the hearings, in addition to effective parliamentary oversight, another lesson is that so many officials in the Trump administration stood up and said, we're not going to be part of this. This is not right.
Yeah, including ex-defense minister.
Many Republicans who supported the president said, we're not going to be part of any effort to subvert an election.
My final point about the young people, younger generation, how they call it, Z generation now. Those people, what would be their attitude to this kind of events, and how to make sure that they are in favor of stronger democracy rather than weaker?
I mean, the answer is you have to participate in political life. You can't let only people who are radicalized participate in political life. That democracy requires every citizen to think about his or her country and to do what they need to do as a civic Democrat to support democratic development.
Then how to get these young people, not only in America, in Mongolia, to be more involved in this, more participated in this process of democracy?
The really young people have the most at stake. I mean, by the time you're old, you're established, you're set, whereas young people have the most to gain or lose from effective democratic politics, and to make sure that politicians represent young people. Mongolia is a very young country. So politicians need to represent young people, and young people need to make their voice heard. So some of the work that IRI does here is to help young people make their voice heard in democratic politics. It's very important.
That's the direction, I think, for further strengthening of democracy in Mongolia.
Absolutely.
So that's so interesting to you. Very pleased to have you on my show. Thank you very much.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for your excellent work.
Thank you. За, хүнд үзэгчдээ өнөөдөр манай Defacto нэвтрүүлгийн зочноор Олон улсын бүгд найрамдахчуудын институт гэж байдаг. Тэр одоо Монголд 30 дахь жилдээ тэмдэглэж байгаа. Тэгээ энэ ойгоор ирсэн ерөнхийлөгч Найрамдахчуудтай ярилцлаа. Баярлалаа.